Imagine you're about to meet Elijah, not a king, not a priest, not someone born into power or privilege, just a man from a dusty, forgotten corner of ancient Israel. A man who would challenge the most powerful rulers of his time. A man who would call down fire from heaven. A man who would face death threats, survive impossible odds, and ultimately leave this world in the most spectacular way imaginable. But before we get to the miracles and the drama, let me tell you why thousands of years later, people still tell this story. It's because Elijah's journey is our journey. He experienced crushing doubt. He felt completely alone. He wondered if anything he did actually mattered. He wanted to give up. And yet, in his darkest moments, he discovered something that changed everything. Tonight, as you listen, you'll hear about moments when the impossible became possible. You'll hear about a 3-year drought that brought a nation to its knees. You'll hear about a widow who made an unthinkable choice that saved her life. You'll hear about a showdown on a mountain that would be talked about for millennia. You'll hear about a gentle whisper that was more powerful than earthquakes and fire. And here's something fascinating to think about as we begin. What if Elijah had said no? What if, when that first impossible command came, he had decided it was too dangerous, too difficult, too unreasonable? The entire history of Israel would have been different. Sometimes the most important moment in any story is the moment someone decides to take the first step, even when they can't see where the path leads. So as you settle in tonight, know that you're not just hearing a story. You're entering a world of ancient kingdoms, desert wildernesses, dramatic confrontations, and quiet moments of profound truth. You're about to witness how one person's courage can inspire millions. You're about to discover why this story has survived when so many others have been forgotten. Take another deep breath. Let your shoulders relax. Feel the tension leaving your body. The story of Elijah is about to begin, and I promise you, by the end of tonight's journey, you'll understand why this tale has the power to change how you see challenges, how you face fears, and how you think about what's truly possible. If you're ready for this journey, if you want more stories like this that help you relax and think deeply as you drift off to sleep, go ahead and subscribe to this channel. We create long-form content specifically designed to engage your mind while calming your spirit. And if you appreciate the effort that goes into researching and presenting these stories, a quick like really helps us continue creating content for you. Now, let's go back 3,000 years. Let's travel to a land scorched by endless sun, where the ground cracked beneath people's feet, where rivers ran dry, and where a nation had forgotten the source of their strength. Let's meet the mysterious man who would change everything. Chapter 2. A mysterious stranger emerges from the desert. The land of Israel was dying. Imagine walking outside and seeing nothing but brown earth, brown grass, dead and brittle, brown hillsides where green used to flourish. The sun beat down day after day with merciless intensity. And there was no relief. No clouds gathered on the horizon. No cool breeze brought the scent of coming rain. Just heat, dust, and the growing fear that this drought might never end. The people of Israel had seen dry seasons before, but this was different. Months had passed without rain, then a year, then longer. Wells that had provided water for generations were running dry. Farmers watched their fields turn to dust. Animals grew thin and weak, and in the villages and towns, people began to whisper, Is God angry with us? Have we done something wrong? They had done something wrong, but most of them didn't realize it yet, or maybe they didn't want to admit it. King Ahab ruled Israel in those days, and he had made choices that brought darkness into the land. He had married Jezebel, a foreign princess who worshipped gods that the Israelites had never heard of. Gods made of stone and metal, gods that couldn't speak, couldn't hear, couldn't do anything at all. But Jezebel was powerful and persuasive. She built temples to her god Baal. She brought hundreds of prophets to teach the people about these false gods. And slowly, steadily, the people of Israel began to forget the true God, who had brought their ancestors out of slavery, who had parted the Red Sea, who had given them this land in the first place. Altars that once held sacrifices to the Lord now stood empty and crumbling. New altars to Baal appeared in towns throughout Israel. The people hedged their bets, worshipping both the Lord and Baal, unwilling to fully commit to either. And God watched all of this happening and knew that something had to change. That's when Elijah appeared. Nobody knows exactly where he came from. The Bible tells us he was from Tishbe in Gilead, a remote, rugged area far from the centers of power. He wasn't a priest trained in the temple. He wasn't a nobleman with connections to the royal court. He wasn't a well-known teacher or respected elder. He was just a man who had heard God's voice and decided to obey. Picture him walking through the wilderness toward the capital city of Samaria. His clothes were simple and rough, the kind of garments a shepherd might wear. His face was weathered from years in the sun and wind. His eyes had an intensity that made people uncomfortable, like he could see things others couldn't. When he walked through villages on his way to confront the king, people stared. Who was this stranger? What did he want? Elijah didn't stop to explain. He had a message to deliver, and nothing would distract him from his mission. When he finally reached the palace in Samaria, he didn't request an audience or wait politely for permission to speak. He walked right into King Ahab's presence, as if he had every right to be there. Imagine Ahab's surprise. Here was a man dressed like a desert wanderer, standing in the magnificent palace, looking the king directly in the eye, without a trace of fear. The servants and advisors in the room held their breath. Who would dare approach the king this way? And then Elijah spoke. His voice was calm, but absolutely certain. As surely as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the years to come, except at my word. Think about that statement for a moment. Elijah wasn't predicting the weather. He wasn't making a guess based on clouds or wind patterns. He was declaring that he personally had the authority to shut up the heavens. He was telling the king of Israel that rain would not fall until he, Elijah, said it could. Ahab must have been stunned. Was this man insane? Was he dangerous? Was he joking? Before the king could formulate a response, before guards could seize this strange prophet, Elijah simply turned and walked out. He didn't wait for permission to leave. He didn't defend his statement or explain himself further. He had delivered God's message, and now he had other places to be. Outside the palace, the sun continued to shine. The sky remained cloudless, and Elijah walked away from the center of power, away from civilization, into the wilderness. He knew what was coming. The drought he had prophesied wasn't just a weather phenomenon. It was a test, a challenge, a way of forcing Israel to confront a crucial question. Who is the real God? Can you imagine what Elijah must have felt as he left that palace? He had just made an enemy of the most powerful man in Israel. He had declared something that would affect every single person in the nation. And now he was walking away, with no army to protect him, no wealth to sustain him, no plan except to listen for God's next instruction. This is where Elijah's story really begins, not with the dramatic miracles yet to come, but with this first act of courage, the willingness to speak truth to power, the readiness to trust God even when it meant putting himself in danger, the decision to obey, regardless of the cost. And here's a question worth pondering as you continue listening tonight. When was the last time you did something that required that kind of courage? When did you last take a stand for what you knew was right, even though it was uncomfortable or risky? Elijah's story challenges us to think about whether we're living with that kind of bold faith, or whether we're playing it safe, hedging our bets, trying to please everyone. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The confrontation with Ahab was just the beginning. The drought was just starting, and Elijah's most amazing adventures were still to come. In the next part of our story, you'll discover where Elijah went after leaving the palace, how he survived when the entire land was drying up, and the surprising way God provided for this faithful prophet. If you're enjoying this journey through Elijah's story, do me a favor and hit that like button. It helps more people discover these long-form stories that are perfect for winding down at the end of the day. And stick with me, because what happens next is going to surprise you. Chapter 3, The Impossible Promise that stopped the rain. The moment Elijah walked out of King Ahab's palace, everything changed. Not immediately in the physical world. The sun still shone, the dust still blew through the streets of Samaria, but spiritually, cosmically, something shifted. Elijah had spoken, and heaven had heard. The rain would not fall. In the ancient world, rain was everything. There were no irrigation systems bringing water from distant sources, no pipes delivering water to every home, no grocery stores stocked with food from around the world. If rain didn't fall, crops didn't grow. If crops didn't grow, people didn't eat. It was that simple and that terrifying. Elijah had just announced that God was shutting off the water supply for an entire nation, not for a few weeks, not for one season, for years. Think about the magnitude of that pronouncement. Every farmer, every family, every living thing in Israel would be affected by what Elijah had just declared. But why? Why would God do something so severe? Here's where the story gets really interesting, and where we need to understand what was happening beneath the surface of daily life in Israel. King Ahab and Queen Jezebel hadn't just tolerated the worship of false gods. They had actively promoted it, built temples for it, and employed hundreds of prophets to teach it. But more than that, they had specifically chosen Baal as their favorite god. And here's the fascinating part. Baal was supposedly the god of storms and rain. People believed Baal controlled the weather, sent the rain, made the crops grow. So when Elijah announced a drought, he wasn't just delivering bad news about the weather, he was directly challenging Baal. It was as if Elijah was saying, "You think Baal controls the rain? Let's find out. Let's see if your God can send even a single drop of water. Let's see who's really in charge here." This wasn't just a weather event. It was a theological showdown, and it would take years to fully play out. Imagine being an ordinary person in Israel when this drought began. At first, maybe you didn't think much of it. Dry spells happened, but then Weeks passed, months passed. The wells started getting lower. The streams started drying up. And you remembered that strange prophet who had appeared at the palace, the one who said the rain wouldn't fall except at his word. Could one man really have that much power? Could the Lord, the God of Israel, really be that displeased with his people? And if so, what would it take to make things right again? These questions rippled through Israel as the drought continued, but Elijah wasn't there to answer them. After delivering his message to Ahab, Elijah had received another instruction from God. Leave here, turn eastward, and hide in the Chariot ravine, east of the Jordan. You will drink from the brook, and I have directed the ravens to supply you with food there. This is one of those moments in the story that reveals so much about faith. God didn't send Elijah to a city where he could stay with friends. He didn't direct him to a wealthy supporter who could provide food and protection. He sent him to a ravine in the wilderness where his only neighbors would be wild animals and birds. Why? Perhaps because what was about to happen in Israel would be so difficult, so painful, that Elijah needed to be separated from it. Or perhaps because Elijah himself needed to learn something about trusting God's provision before he could teach that lesson to others. Or perhaps because if Elijah had stayed in populated areas, Ahab would have hunted him down and killed him. Whatever the reason, Elijah obeyed. He left behind any possibility of comfort or security and headed to the Chariot ravine. And when he got there, he discovered that God's provision looks very different from human planning. The brook provided water, which was essential, but food. God had said he would send ravens to feed Elijah. Ravens, large black birds known for being scavengers, not helpers. Birds that took food, not delivered it. And yet, that's exactly what happened. Every morning and every evening, ravens came to Elijah carrying bread and meat. Picture that scene. This solitary man sitting by a small brook in a desolate ravine, and these wild birds flying in with food in their beaks, dropping it near him and flying away. Day after day after day. Where did the ravens get the food? The Bible doesn't say. Maybe from King Ahab's kitchens, which would be deeply ironic. The king unknowingly feeding the prophet he probably wanted dead. Maybe from somewhere else entirely. The point isn't where the food came from. The point is that God provided in a completely unexpected way. This is a theme that runs throughout Elijah's entire story. God's provision rarely looks like what we expect. We want security, stability, predictable income, and comfortable circumstances. God often gives us just enough for today, delivered in surprising ways, requiring us to trust him again tomorrow. Elijah sat by that brook, ate food brought by birds, and watched as the nation he loved suffered under the drought he had pronounced. What did he think about during those long days and nights? Did he wonder if he had done the right thing? Did he worry about the people going hungry? Did he question whether this extreme measure was really necessary? The Bible doesn't tell us Elijah's private thoughts during this time. But we know he stayed at the Chariot ravine for a significant period, and we know that eventually, inevitably, the brook began to dry up. The same drought that was devastating Israel finally affected Elijah's water source too. And that's where our story takes another unexpected turn. Because when the brook dried up, God didn't say, "Okay, that's enough. Let's end the drought now." Instead, he gave Elijah another impossible instruction that would test his faith even more than hiding in a ravine. eating bird-delivered bread. But before we continue, think about this. Elijah could have panicked when the brook dried up. He could have decided to take matters into his own hands, to leave his hiding place and find his own solution. But he didn't. He waited for God's next instruction. He trusted that the same God who had provided food through ravens could provide whatever he needed next. How often do we do the opposite? How often do we panic at the first sign of trouble, rush to fix things ourselves, and forget to wait and listen for God's guidance? Elijah's patience in this moment is just as miraculous as the ravens bringing food. Coming up next in our story, you're going to hear about one of the most touching encounters in Elijah's entire journey. A meeting with a desperate woman that would result in miracles, heartbreak, and ultimately a demonstration of God's power over life and death itself. But that brook needed to dry up first. That security needed to disappear, because what came next required even greater faith. Stay with me as we continue this journey, and if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel so you never miss these long-form stories that help you relax, think deeply, and drift off peacefully. The best part of Elijah's story is still ahead. Chapter 4, Surviving Alone, Ravens, Brooks, and Divine Provision. The Chariot ravine was not a comfortable place. It was isolated, rocky, far from any town or village. When Elijah first arrived, following God's specific instructions, he must have wondered what he was getting into. This wasn't a vacation spot. This wasn't a peaceful retreat. This was wilderness survival, and Elijah was about to learn lessons about trust that would prepare him for everything still to come. Let's pause for a moment and really picture this scene, because it's easy to rush past it in telling Elijah's story. But this period in the ravine was crucial. Elijah was completely alone. No human contact, no news from the outside world, no way of knowing what was happening in Israel, whether the drought was having its intended effect, whether King Ahab was looking for him, whether the people were turning back to God. Just Elijah, the brook, the rocks, and the ravens. Morning and evening, every single day, these birds would arrive with food, bread and meat, the Bible tells us. Simple food, but sufficient. Enough to keep Elijah alive and healthy, but nothing extra. No feasts, no variety, no luxuries, just provision. There's something profound about this arrangement. God could have sent Elijah to a wealthy family who would hide him and feed him lavishly. God could have made Elijah's hiding place a lush oasis with fruit trees and abundant game. But instead, God chose the most unlikely, most humble form of provision imaginable. Why does this matter? Because Elijah was about to spend years teaching Israel about trusting God instead of trusting in Baal, instead of trusting in wealth or political power or human planning. And you can't teach what you haven't learned. Elijah needed to experience radical dependence on God's provision before he could call others to that same dependence. Think about what it means to eat food brought by wild birds. Every morning, when Elijah woke up, he had to trust that the ravens would come. He couldn't stockpile food for weeks in advance. He couldn't plant crops or hunt game in that barren ravine. He was completely dependent on something he couldn't control, couldn't predict, and couldn't ensure would continue. That's real trust. Not the kind of trust where you have 3 backup plans just in case. Not the kind of faith where you're mostly relying on God, but also have your own safety nets in place. This was naked, vulnerable dependence on divine provision. And it worked. Day after day, week after week, month after month, the ravens came. The brook flowed. Elijah survived and even thrived in that unlikely place. He had time to think, to pray, to listen to God without the distractions of normal life. In some ways, this season of isolation was a gift, preparing Elijah for the intense confrontations that lay ahead. But nothing lasts forever, and eventually, the inevitable happened. The brook began to shrink. The water level dropped day by day. The same drought that was devastating Israel's valley reached even this small, seemingly protected stream. Elijah watched as his water source slowly disappeared. Here's what's fascinating about this moment. God didn't send rain to refill the brook. God didn't miraculously make that one stream flow forever while the rest of the nation suffered drought. Even Elijah, God's faithful prophet, had to experience the consequences of the drought he had pronounced. This tells us something important about how God works. Being faithful to God doesn't mean we're exempt from hardship. It doesn't mean we get a special pass that lets us avoid the difficult circumstances that affect everyone else. Elijah experienced the same drought as every other person in Israel. The difference was that Elijah had God's promise of provision, even when the circumstances looked hopeless. As the brook dried to a trickle, then to a few isolated pools, then to damp stones, then to nothing but dust, Elijah faced a choice. Would he panic? Would he abandon his hiding place and try to find water on his own? Would he doubt that God could provide what he needed? The Bible doesn't record any crisis of faith at this moment for Elijah. Instead, we simply read that when the brook dried up, God spoke to him again with new instructions. God wasn't surprised that the water ran out. God wasn't scrambling to come up with a backup plan. This was all part of the larger story, and God's next instruction would take Elijah somewhere even more unexpected than a ravine fed by ravens. But before we move to that next chapter, let's consider what this part of Elijah's story means for us. We all go through dry seasons in life, times when our resources run low, times when what used to sustain us doesn't seem adequate anymore. Times when our security disappears and we don't know where the next provision will come from. Elijah's experience at Kerith Ravine teaches us that these dry seasons don't mean God has abandoned us. They don't mean we did something wrong or that we're being punished. Sometimes the brook dries up simply because it's time to move to the next place, to learn the next lesson, to see God provide in a new way. The question isn't whether our brooks will dry up. They will. Life guarantees that our circumstances will change, that what works today might not work tomorrow, that we'll face situations where our usual solutions aren't available. The question is how we'll respond when it happens. Will we trust that God has a next step for us? Will we wait to hear His guidance before running off in panic? Will we remember all the times He's provided before and believe He can provide again? Elijah passed this test. He stayed at the ravine until God spoke. He didn't leave early out of fear. He didn't stay too long out of stubbornness. He remained attentive to God's voice. And when the instruction came, he was ready to obey again, even though he had no idea what awaited him at his next destination. And what awaited him was one of the most beautiful, surprising, and challenging episodes in his entire story. A meeting that would test his faith in new ways. a miracle that would sustain 3 people through impossible circumstances, and eventually a heartbreaking crisis that would lead to one of the most powerful demonstrations of God's power in the entire Old Testament. But we're getting ahead of ourselves again. For now, picture Elijah one last time at that dried-up brook, listening as God says, "Go at once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon and stay there. I have directed a widow there to supply you with food." Zarephath, not in Israel, but in Sidon, foreign territory. Baal's home turf, actually. Sidon was where Queen Jezebel had come from, where Baal worship was the main religion. And God was sending Elijah there to be fed by a widow who in that culture would be among the poorest, most vulnerable people. If you're still with me on this journey through Elijah's life, thank you. We're building toward the most dramatic moments of his story. But these quieter episodes are so important for understanding who Elijah was and why his later actions had such impact. If this story is helping you wind down tonight, hit that like button to let me know. And let's continue together to Zarephath, where Elijah was about to learn that God's provision often comes from the most unlikely sources. Chapter 5, The Widow's Last Meal and an Unthinkable Request. The journey from the Chariot ravine to Zarephath was not short. Elijah had to travel north, through parched landscape, past dried-up fields and desperate villages, into foreign territory. Every step took him farther from the familiar and deeper into the unknown. Zarephath was a small coastal town in the region of Sidon. Remember, this was Queen Jezebel's homeland. This was where Baal worship wasn't just accepted, but celebrated. Elijah wasn't walking into neutral territory. He was walking into the heart of the very religion he had challenged by pronouncing the drought. But God had said a widow in Zarephath would provide for him. So Elijah went. When he finally arrived at the town gate, tired and thirsty from his journey, he saw a woman gathering sticks. Something about her caught his attention. Maybe it was the way she moved, slow and defeated. Maybe it was divine intuition. Whatever the reason, Elijah knew this was the woman God had sent him to find. He approached her and made a simple request. "Would you bring me a little water in a jar so I may have a drink?" It was a reasonable thing to ask. Travelers asked for water all the time. But remember, there was a severe drought. Water was precious. Every drop was measured and rationed. Still, the widow agreed. She turned to go get water for this stranger. As she was leaving, Elijah called after her with another request. "And bring me, please, a piece of bread." This second request changed everything. The widow stopped and turned back to face him. And the words she spoke next revealed just how desperate her situation was. "As surely as the Lord your God lives," she said, "I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I am gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." Read that last part again. That we may eat it and die. This woman wasn't exaggerating. She wasn't being dramatic. She was stating a simple, terrible fact. She had just enough ingredients to make one final, tiny meal for herself and her young son. After that, they would starve to death. The drought that Elijah had pronounced on Israel had spread beyond Israel's borders. This foreign woman in this foreign town was suffering the same fate as everyone else in the region. And Elijah had just asked her to give him some of her last food. Put yourself in the widow's position for a moment. Your child is going to die. You're going to die. You've accepted this as inevitable. You're gathering firewood to cook your final meal, and a stranger walks up and asks you to feed him instead. What would you do? Most people would say no. Most people would think, "I'm sorry for your situation, stranger, but I have to take care of my child first. I can't possibly give you what little I have left." But Elijah wasn't deterred by her explanation. In fact, he made an even more outrageous request. He said to her, "Don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said, but first make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me, and then make something for yourself and your son. First, make some for me." Those words must have sounded insane to the widow, cruel even. How could this man ask her to feed him first, before her own child? But then Elijah said something that transformed everything. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says: "The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry, until the day the Lord sends rain on the land." This was a promise, a guarantee, a miraculous claim. If the widow would trust this stranger, if she would take the risk of feeding him first with her last resources, then somehow, impossibly, her flour and oil would not run out. She would have enough, not just for that day, but for as long as the drought lasted. Now, think about the choice facing this woman. She didn't know Elijah. She had no reason to trust him. She wasn't an Israelite. So she probably didn't know much about the Lord, the God of Israel. She could see her jar of flour and her jug of oil. She knew exactly how little was there, and she had to decide, would she trust this promise, or would she do what made logical sense and feed her son first? Here's what's beautiful about this moment. The widow chose faith over logic. The Bible simply says, she went away and did as Elijah had told her. No recorded arguments, no negotiations, no demanding proof first. She just went and did it. She took her handful of flour and her little bit of oil, and she baked bread for Elijah. She gave it to him, and then she made some for herself and her son. And when she checked the flour jar afterward, it wasn't empty. When she looked at the oil jug, it still had oil in it. The next day, she made bread again. The flour jar didn't empty. The oil jug didn't run dry. Day after day, week after week, month after month, that small amount of flour and oil kept producing just enough, not overflowing, not filling the whole house with abundance, just enough for each day's needs. 3 people, Elijah, the widow, and her son, lived on this miraculous provision. In the middle of a devastating drought, while people all around them were suffering and dying, this household had what they needed, not because they were wealthy or powerful or special, but because one woman chose to trust an impossible promise. Think about what this story reveals about how God works. The widow gave away what she thought was her last hope, and in doing so, she received something far better. She acted in faith when every logical calculation said she shouldn't, and her faith was rewarded with sustained provision. This is a pattern we see throughout the Bible and throughout life. God often asks us to give before we receive, to trust before we see results, to step out in faith before the path is clear. And when we do, we discover that God's provision is more reliable than any human planning or earthly security. For the widow of Zarephath, this daily miracle must have been astounding at first, then gradually became routine. Every morning she'd go to the jar and find flour. Every evening she'd pour oil and find enough. What started as an impossible promise became daily reality. And for Elijah, this period living with the widow and her son must have been a welcome change from the isolation of the Kerith ravine. He was part of a household again, watching a young boy play, sharing meals with a family, experiencing something like normal life, even in the midst of extraordinary circumstances. But as we'll discover in the next chapter, even miraculous provision doesn't exempt us from tragedy. Even when God is clearly at work, heartbreaking things can still happen, and sometimes those heartbreaks become the setting for even greater miracles. The peaceful days in the widow's home were about to be shattered by every parent's worst nightmare. But I don't want to rush past this beautiful moment. A desperate woman trusting an impossible promise. A prophet finding refuge with unlikely friends. A child going to bed with a full stomach day after day, when by all rights he should have been dead from starvation. Before we continue, if you're finding peace in this story tonight, if it's helping you relax and reflect as you prepare for sleep, would you subscribe to this channel? We create these long-form narratives specifically for people who want something meaningful and calming to listen to at night. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss future stories. Now, take a deep breath and prepare yourself for what comes next. Because the story of Elijah and the widow is about to take a devastating turn that will test both of them in ways they never imagined possible. Chapter 6, When Death Came Knocking, a mother's worst nightmare. Time passed peacefully in the widow's home at Zarephath. The flour jar continued its daily miracle. The oil jug never ran dry. Elijah stayed with this small family, and life developed a comfortable rhythm. In a world suffering from severe drought and famine, this little house had become an island of provision and peace. The widow's son was a bright, energetic boy. We don't know his name. The Bible doesn't record it, but we can imagine him playing in the courtyard, helping his mother gather water, perhaps asking Elijah questions about his homeland of Israel. This child, who had been on the brink of starvation, was now healthy and thriving, living proof of God's miraculous provision. But then, everything changed in the worst way possible. The Bible tells us that sometime later, the son became ill. It started suddenly, as these things often do. Maybe a fever, maybe trouble breathing. The illness came on strong and fast, and it was serious from the beginning. The widow, who had learned to trust in God's provision for daily bread, now faced something far more terrifying than hunger. Her son was dying. She did everything she could. We can imagine her trying every remedy she knew, staying up through the night, applying cool cloths to his fevered forehead, pleading with him to stay with her, to fight, to hold on. But the illness was too powerful. Despite all her efforts, despite her prayers, despite everything she tried, the child's breathing became more and more labored. His fever raged, and finally, the worst moment imaginable arrived. The boy stopped breathing entirely. He was dead. The widow's anguish exploded into anger, and she turned that anger on Elijah. She confronted him with words that revealed the depth of her pain. "What do you have against me, man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son?" Try to understand what was happening in her mind and heart at that moment. Before Elijah came, she and her son were about to die together. It would have been peaceful in a way. They would have shared that final meal and slipped away from a world that had become too harsh to survive in. But then Elijah came with his promise, and she had hope again. She had watched her son eating day after day, growing stronger. laughing and playing. She had believed that maybe, just maybe, they would survive this drought after all. And now her son was dead anyway. From her perspective, Elijah's presence had made everything worse. The miracle had only delayed the inevitable and made the final loss more painful. And in her ancient worldview, she assumed this must be punishment for something she had done wrong. Some sin from her past had been noticed by this powerful God of Israel, and the price was her son's life. Elijah didn't argue with her or defend himself. He simply said, "Give me your son." He took the dead child from her arms. Imagine the weight of that lifeless body, and carried him upstairs to the room where Elijah stayed. He laid the boy on the bed and then did something remarkable. He prayed, but not a calm, peaceful prayer. This was a wrestling prayer, a desperate prayer. "Lord my God, have you brought tragedy even on this widow I am staying with by causing her son to die?" Elijah was questioning God, demanding answers. This wasn't polite religion. This was raw, honest conversation with the creator of the universe. And then Elijah did something even more remarkable. He stretched himself out on top of the dead child 3 times and cried out, "Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him." This is such a powerful image. Elijah literally covering the dead child with his own body, calling on God to reverse death itself, not asking for healing of sickness. The boy was already dead, not requesting a miracle of provision like the flour and oil. This was something far more impossible. Elijah was asking God to bring someone back from death. Why did Elijah have faith that this could happen? The Bible doesn't tell us. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was his relationship with God giving him confidence to ask for the impossible. Maybe it was knowing that this child's death would destroy the widow's fragile faith. Whatever the reason, Elijah asked for something unprecedented, and God answered. The Bible says simply, "The Lord heard Elijah's cry, and the boy's life returned to him, and he lived." Can you imagine what happened in that moment? The child's chest suddenly moving with breath, his eyes opening, color returning to his face, life flowing back into a body that had been lifeless. Elijah, watching this miracle unfold right in front of him, must have been overcome with joy and awe and relief. He picked up the living, breathing child and carried him downstairs to his mother. "Look," Elijah said, "your son is alive." The widow's response is beautiful and profound. "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth." It's interesting what she said there. She didn't say, "Thank you so much," or "I can't believe it." She made a statement about truth and about Elijah's identity. Through this devastating experience and miraculous restoration, her faith had moved to a completely new level. She had trusted Elijah's promise about flour and oil, but maybe there had been some doubt. Maybe she had wondered if it was just a lucky coincidence, if the prophet was a good man, but not necessarily speaking for God. But now, after seeing her son actually dead and then alive again, there was no more room for doubt. She knew with absolute certainty that Elijah was God's representative, and that God was real and powerful and trustworthy. Sometimes faith is forged in the fire of our worst experiences. Sometimes we don't really know what we believe until we face something devastating and discover whether our faith can hold us through it. The widow's faith was tested in the worst way imaginable, and on the other side of that test, she emerged with unshakable conviction. For Elijah, this miracle was also significant. He had pronounced a drought and seen it happen. He had been fed by ravens and sustained by never-ending flour and oil. But calling someone back from death, that was something else entirely. That was God demonstrating power over the ultimate enemy, death itself. This miracle foreshadowed something that would become central to faith thousands of years later. The belief that God can overcome death, that the end isn't really the end, that life can triumph over death. When Jesus later raised people from the dead, he was following a pattern that Elijah had been part of establishing centuries earlier. But we need to ask some hard questions about this story too. Why did the boy have to die in the first place? Why did the widow have to suffer that anguish? Why did God allow this tragedy before performing the miracle? The Bible doesn't answer these questions directly, but we can observe that both the widow and Elijah were changed by this experience. Their faith deepened, their understanding of God's power expanded, and their story would be told for thousands of years, encouraging countless others who face loss and devastation. Sometimes God allows us to walk through valleys of shadow, so that when we emerge on the other side, we truly know, not just believe, but know that He is powerful, present, and trustworthy. Sometimes our most difficult moments become our most powerful testimonies. As we continue Elijah's story, remember that widow and her son living in Zarephath, sustained by daily miracles, marked forever by a brush with death and resurrection. They were part of something bigger than themselves, part of a story that would echo through history. And Elijah, carrying those experiences with him, was being prepared for his greatest challenge yet. The drought continued. Israel continued to suffer. And the time was coming for a confrontation that would be talked about for millennia, the showdown on Mount Carmel. If you're still listening, still journeying with me through this ancient story, I hope you're feeling relaxed and peaceful. These stories of faith, crisis, and miraculous resolution have a way of putting our own lives in perspective, don't they? If this content is meaningful to you, please share it with someone who might need to hear these stories of hope and divine power. Now, settle in for what comes next. Because Elijah was about to leave the safety of the widow's home and return to Israel for the most dramatic confrontation of his entire ministry. Chapter 7, Showdown on the Mountain. 450 against 1, 3 years passed. 3 long years of drought. 3 years of suffering for the nation of Israel. The brooks had dried up. The fields had turned to dust. Animals died. People went hungry. And still no rain fell. King Ahab's kingdom was in crisis. And the king himself had spent those years searching for Elijah, the prophet who had pronounced this disaster and then disappeared. During those 3 years, Elijah had been hidden away, first at the Chariot ravine, then in Zarephath with the widow and her son. But the time for hiding was over. God spoke to Elijah again. "Go and present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the land." Finally, the drought would end. But first, something important needed to happen. The people of Israel needed to make a choice. They needed to decide once and for all whom they would serve. The Lord, the God of their ancestors, or Baal, the god that Queen Jezebel had promoted. Elijah set out to find King Ahab. When they finally met, Ahab's first words were accusatory. "Is that you, you troubler of Israel? Troubler of Israel." That's what Ahab called Elijah. In the king's mind, this prophet was responsible for all the suffering of the past 3 years. If Elijah hadn't pronounced the drought, there would be no problem. Never mind that Israel had abandoned God and was worshipping false idols. Never mind that the whole reason for the drought was to wake people up spiritually. In Ahab's mind, Elijah was the problem. Elijah shot back with the truth. I have not made trouble for Israel, but you and your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals. Then Elijah issued a challenge that must have stunned everyone who heard it. Now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah, who eat at Jezebel's table. This was bold. This was audacious. Elijah was calling for a public showdown, not a private conversation, not a quiet theological debate, a massive public confrontation between himself, one prophet of the Lord, and 850 prophets of false gods. King Ahab could have refused. He could have arrested Elijah on the spot, but something made him agree. Maybe he was curious. Maybe he thought his prophets would win and he could finally discredit Elijah. Maybe after 3 years of drought, he was desperate enough to try anything. Whatever the reason, Ahab sent word throughout Israel. Everyone gather at Mount Carmel. The prophet Elijah has issued a challenge. Picture the scene as people from all over Israel began making their way to Mount Carmel. They were weak from years of poor nutrition. They were exhausted from struggling to survive. But they came, thousands of them, because they had heard about Elijah's dramatic challenge to the king and to the prophets of Baal. Mount Carmel itself was significant. It was a high place, visible from all around. It was also associated with Baal worship. There were altars to Baal on that mountain. Elijah was taking the fight to the enemy's territory. When everyone had gathered, the people, King Ahab, the 450 prophets of Baal, the prophets of Asherah apparently didn't show up. Elijah stepped forward to address the crowd. His first words cut right to the heart of Israel's problem. How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. How long will you waver between two opinions? That was Israel's issue. They weren't fully committed to Baal, but they weren't fully committed to the Lord either. They were trying to have it both ways, worshipping both, hedging their bets, keeping their options open. And Elijah was saying, "No more. Today you choose. One or the other. No more wavering. No more fence-sitting." The Bible says the people said nothing. Can you imagine that moment of silence? Thousands of people not knowing what to say. Uncomfortable with being forced to make this choice. Still wanting to avoid committing fully to either side. So Elijah explained what would happen next. He and the prophets of Baal would each prepare a bull for sacrifice. They would place the bulls on altars but not light any fire. Then the prophets of Baal would call on their God, and Elijah would call on the Lord. The God who answers by fire, he is God. The people agreed. What you say is good. They were willing to watch this test. Whoever's God sent fire to burn up the sacrifice would prove he was real. It was a simple, clear, dramatic test. Elijah told the prophets of Baal to go first. They prepared their bull, placed it on the altar, and began calling on Baal to send fire. "Baal, answer us," they shouted. They danced around the altar. They chanted. They pleaded. "Baal, answer us! Baal, answer us!" Morning passed. Hours went by. Nothing happened. No fire, no response. The altar sat there undisturbed, the sacrifice growing warm in the sun but not burning. At noon, Elijah started mocking them. This is one of the most sarcastic passages in the entire Bible. "Shout louder," Elijah called out. "Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought or busy or traveling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened." Imagine the scene. Elijah standing there calmly, taunting 450 increasingly desperate prophets. The crowd watching, probably some laughing now at the prophet's failure, and the prophets themselves shouting louder, becoming more frantic. They even cut themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. They prophesied frantically. They worked themselves into a frenzy. But nothing happened. The Bible says it clearly. There was no response. No one answered. No one paid attention. Afternoon came. Still nothing. The prophets of Baal were exhausted, bloody, hoarse from shouting, and their altar remained cold. Their God had not answered. Finally, as evening approached, it was Elijah's turn, and what he did next was so dramatic, so bold, so seemingly crazy that everyone watching must have thought he had lost his mind. But we'll discover what happened next in the following chapter. For now, picture this scene. A mountain crowded with people, an exhausted group of failed prophets, a king watching anxiously, and one prophet of the Lord, calm and confident, about to do something that would change everything. If you're enjoying this journey through Elijah's story, remember to subscribe to this channel for more long-form content that helps you relax and reflect at the end of your day. And hit that like button if you're appreciating the story so far. What happens next is the climax of Elijah's showdown with Baal, and it's absolutely spectacular. Chapter 8, the challenge that would decide everything. The prophets of Baal had failed completely. Hours of shouting, dancing, and even self-harm had produced nothing. No fire, no response, no sign that their God existed or cared. The crowd watching on Mount Carmel had seen with their own eyes that Baal was powerless. Now it was Elijah's turn, and he was going to make absolutely sure that when God answered, no one could doubt it was a miracle. Elijah called all the people to come closer. He wanted them to see everything he was about to do. First, he repaired the altar of the Lord that had been torn down. This itself was significant. There had once been proper worship of God on this mountain, but it had been destroyed during Jezebel's campaign to eliminate the worship of the true God. Elijah was restoring what had been broken. He took 12 stones, one for each tribe of Israel, representing the entire nation that had been united under God before they split into northern and southern kingdoms. This was a reminder of who they were meant to be, one people under one God. With these stones, Elijah rebuilt the altar. Then he arranged the wood on top of it and cut the bull into pieces and laid it on the wood, just as the prophets of Baal had done with their sacrifice. But then Elijah did something that seemed absolutely insane. He had men dig a trench around the altar, a trench large enough to hold about 4 gallons of water. Then he said, "Fill 4 large jars with water and pour it on the offering and on the wood." Water. Remember, this was the 3rd year of severe drought. Water was precious. Water was scarce. Every drop was needed for drinking, for survival, and Elijah was about to waste gallons of it by pouring it over his sacrifice. But he wasn't done. After they poured 4 jars of water over the altar, soaking the wood and the meat, Elijah said, "Do it again." So they did it again, pouring more precious water over the already wet altar. And then, incredibly, Elijah said, Do it a third time. They poured a third round of water, 12 jars total, until the wood was completely saturated, the meat was dripping wet, and water ran down and filled the trench around the altar. Why would Elijah do this? Think about it. If he was going to fake a miracle somehow, if he had hidden coals in the wood, or had some trick planned, soaking everything with water would ruin it. No normal fire could burn through that much water. Wet wood doesn't burn. Wet meat doesn't ignite. Elijah was making it impossible for anyone to claim trickery later. He was eliminating every possible natural explanation for what was about to happen. When God answered, it would be undeniable. As evening approached, the time of the evening sacrifice, Elijah stepped forward. The crowd fell silent. Even the failed prophets of Baal stopped their noise. Everyone watched as this solitary prophet prepared to call on his God. And Elijah prayed, not screaming, not dancing, not cutting himself. His prayer was simple, direct, and powerful. Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. That's it. No dramatic performance, no hours of pleading, just a simple prayer, asking God to reveal himself so that the people would know the truth and return to him. And then it happened. Fire fell from heaven, not a little spark, not a small flame that gradually grew. Fire exploded down from the sky and consumed everything. The sacrifice, the wood, the stones, the soil, and even the water in the trench. Everything was burned up instantly in a blast of divine fire. The people watching fell on their faces and cried out, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." Over and over they shouted it. There was no more wavering, no more trying to serve both God and Baal. They had seen undeniable proof of who the real God was. This was the moment everything changed. After 3 years of drought, after years of Israel sliding into idolatry, after the influence of Jezebel and her hundreds of prophets, the nation had finally witnessed something that couldn't be denied or explained away. God had shown up in undeniable power, but Elijah wasn't done yet. He commanded the people, "Seize the prophets of Baal. Don't let anyone get away." The people obeyed, capturing all 450 prophets who had failed so spectacularly. Elijah had them brought down to the Kishon Valley, and there they were executed according to the law that said false prophets should be put to death. This might seem harsh to modern readers, but understand what was at stake. These prophets had been leading Israel away from God, teaching people to worship idols, corrupting the nation spiritually. They had eaten at Jezebel's table while the people starved. They had promoted lies while claiming to speak for God. The execution was judgment for their role in Israel's spiritual downfall. With the prophets of Baal dealt with, Elijah turned to King Ahab with a surprising message. "Go, eat and drink, for there is the sound of a heavy rain." The sound of rain. The sky was still cloudless. The air was still dry. But Elijah could hear it coming. Or rather, God had told him it was coming. And Elijah believed it so completely that he spoke of it as if it had already arrived. Ahab went off to eat and drink. But Elijah climbed to the top of Carmel, bent down to the ground, and put his face between his knees. He was praying again, but now he was praying for the rain that God had promised. He told his servant, "Go and look toward the sea." The servant went and looked and came back saying, "There is nothing there." Elijah said, "Go back 7 times." This happened again and again. The servant would look, see nothing, and return, and each time Elijah would send him back. 6 times the servant came back reporting no clouds, no sign of rain, but the 7th time the servant reported, "A cloud as small as a man's hand is rising from the sea." That was all Elijah needed to hear. He sent word to Ahab, "Hitch up your chariot and go down before the rain stops you." One small cloud was enough. The rain was coming, and it came. The Bible says the sky grew black with clouds, the wind rose, and a heavy rain started falling. The drought that had lasted 3 years was breaking. God had sent fire, and now he was sending rain. Both promises fulfilled, both demonstrations of power. There's a detail at the end of this story that's easy to miss, but absolutely remarkable. As Ahab rode his chariot down the mountain in the rain, heading back to his palace in Jezreel, the power of the Lord came on Elijah, and tucking his cloak into his belt, he ran ahead of Ahab all the way to Jezreel. Think about that. Elijah, who had just orchestrated this massive confrontation, who had rebuilt an altar, who had overseen the execution of 450 prophets, who had prayed intensely for rain, this same Elijah, filled with supernatural energy, outran the king's chariot. It was about 17 miles from Mount Carmel to Jezreel, and Elijah ran the whole way, arriving before Ahab's horses could get there. It was a day of miracles, fire from heaven, the breaking of a 3-year drought, and supernatural stamina for a prophet who had just experienced the most dramatic day of his entire ministry. The showdown on Mount Carmel was over. God had won decisively. The people had seen the truth. Baal had been proven false. The rain had returned. Everything Elijah had worked toward for 3 years had been accomplished. But here's an important question. What happens after your greatest victory? What comes after your biggest success? What do you do when you've accomplished what you set out to do and proved everything you needed to prove? For Elijah, the answer was both surprising and troubling. Because what came next wasn't celebration or rest or reward. What came next was one of the darkest periods of Elijah's entire life. A time when this mighty prophet who had just called down fire from heaven would find himself running for his life, wishing he was dead. But that's the next chapter of our story. For now, rest in the victory on Mount Carmel. Remember that moment when fire fell and water evaporated, and everyone watching knew without doubt that God was real and powerful. Remember that sometimes God shows up in ways that are undeniable, unmistakable, and utterly transformative. If this story is resonating with you tonight, if it's helping you wind down and reflect, please hit that subscribe button and share this video with someone who might need to hear these ancient stories of faith and divine power. And stay with me, because Elijah's journey isn't over yet, and what happens next reveals something profound about the human experience of faith. Chapter 9, Fire from Heaven and the Victory That Changed Israel. The fire that fell on Mount Carmel did more than just burn a sacrifice. It burned away years of doubt. It burned away the influence of false prophets. It burned away the question of who was really God. In one spectacular moment, everything changed for Israel. Imagine being in that crowd, watching as flames exploded from heaven with such force that they consumed not just wood and meat, but stones and water. The sheer power of it would have been overwhelming. The heat, the light, the unmistakable sense that you were witnessing something divine. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a lucky break or good timing. This was God making his presence known in the most undeniable way possible, and the people's response, falling on their faces and crying out, "The Lord, he is God," wasn't optional or polite. It was the only possible reaction to what they had just witnessed. But let's think about why this moment was so important. For 3 years, the people of Israel had been suffering under drought. They had been told by Elijah that this was because of their idolatry, their worship of Baal. But Baal's prophets had probably been telling them something different, that the drought would end if they worshipped Baal more faithfully, if they built more altars, if they made more sacrifices. So the people were caught between competing claims. Who was telling the truth? Which God should they follow? The Mount Carmel showdown settled that question once and for all. Baal had 450 prophets, hours of opportunity, and a whole day to respond. He sent nothing. The Lord had one prophet, one simple prayer, and immediate, overwhelming response. This is what faith sometimes needs. Not because God has to prove himself, but because we humans are so prone to doubt, so easily swayed by popular opinion, so tempted to follow what everyone else is doing. The fire from heaven was God's mercy, giving the people clear evidence so they could make an informed choice. And the rain that followed was equally important. Rain meant life. Rain meant crops would grow again. Rain meant the suffering would end. Rain meant God wasn't just powerful, but also caring. He could have proven his power with fire and then let the drought continue as punishment. But he didn't. The moment his point was made, he sent relief. For Ahab, riding back to his palace in the rain, this day should have been life-changing. He had seen everything: the failure of Baal's prophets, the fire from heaven, the execution of the false prophets, the ending of the drought. He should have returned to his palace determined to remove every idol from Israel, to restore the worship of the true God, to turn his nation back to the Lord. But here's where the story takes a disturbing turn, because even after witnessing undeniable miracles, even after seeing proof that the Lord was the true God, Ahab went home and told his wife Jezebel everything that had happened. And Jezebel's response wasn't repentance or awe, it was rage. This teaches us something uncomfortable about human nature. Seeing miracles doesn't necessarily change hearts. Having proof doesn't automatically produce faith. Some people, even when confronted with overwhelming evidence of God's power, will still choose their own way. Jezebel had built her identity, power, and influence around the worship of Baal. She had brought prophets from her homeland. She had built temples. She had made Baal worship fashionable and popular. The events on Mount Carmel weren't just a theological defeat for her. They were a personal humiliation and a threat to her power. So instead of bowing to the obvious truth that the Lord was God, Jezebel decided to fight back. She sent a message to Elijah: "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them," meaning like one of the dead prophets of Baal. This was a death threat, clear and direct. Jezebel was promising to kill Elijah within 24 hours. And she made sure Elijah received this message. She wanted him to know he was being hunted. She wanted him to be afraid. Think about the timing of this threat. Yesterday, Elijah had experienced the greatest triumph of his ministry. He had seen God answer spectacularly. He had watched as the nation acknowledged the truth. He had witnessed the end of the devastating drought. He should have been celebrating, resting in victory, basking in success. Instead, within hours, he received a death threat from the queen, and something in Elijah broke. This mighty prophet who had stood fearlessly before King Ahab, who had challenged 450 prophets alone, who had called down fire from heaven. This same Elijah heard Jezebel's threat and ran for his life. The Bible says, Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. That simple statement reveals something profound. Elijah was human. Despite all the miracles he had witnessed and performed, despite his close relationship with God, despite his remarkable courage up to this point, he was capable of fear. And in that moment of fear, his faith faltered. He ran south, fleeing from Israel into Judah, putting as much distance as possible between himself and Jezebel. He left his servant behind and went a day's journey into the wilderness. And there, sitting under a broom bush in the desert, exhausted and emotionally shattered, Elijah prayed a prayer that revealed his complete despair. I have had enough, Lord. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors. This is shocking to read. The prophet who had just experienced the greatest victory of his ministry was now asking God to kill him. What happened? How did Elijah go from the mountain of triumph to the valley of despair so quickly? This is the reality of the human experience. Even for people of great faith, we can experience incredible highs and devastating lows, sometimes within hours of each other. Victory doesn't make us immune to discouragement. Success doesn't protect us from depression. And even the most courageous people have moments when fear overwhelms them. Elijah's despair was so complete that after praying for death, he lay down under that bush and fell asleep. He had given up. He saw no way forward. He felt completely alone and defeated. The contrast with his confidence on Mount Carmel couldn't be more stark. But God's response to Elijah's despair is beautiful and instructive, and we'll explore it in the next chapter. For now, consider this. What do you do when your greatest victories are followed by crushing defeats? What do you do when you've seen God work powerfully, but then face circumstances that make you want to give up? What do you do when fear overwhelms faith? Elijah's story doesn't shy away from these uncomfortable realities. It shows us a real person with real struggles, someone who experienced both the heights of spiritual victory and the depths of emotional despair. And that honesty makes his story even more valuable, because it means his experience can speak to ours. If you're finding value in this honest exploration of faith, struggle, and divine power, please like this video and share it with others who might need to hear that even great people of faith have moments of weakness. And subscribe to this channel for more long-form content that engages both mind and spirit as you prepare for rest. Now, let's follow Elijah into the wilderness and discover how God meets his servants in their darkest moments. Because the story of Elijah isn't over. In fact, some of the most profound moments are still to come. Chapter 10. Running from Victory. The prophet's darkest hour, Elijah lay under a broom bush in the wilderness, emotionally and physically exhausted. He had asked God to take his life. He had reached the point where death seemed preferable to continuing his mission, and then he fell asleep, perhaps hoping he wouldn't wake up. But God had different plans.